1, 2, 3, 4, 5. No, Lou Bega hasn't just entered the building. These are the big 5 strikes, as the US leveled one blow after another against Iran. The regime had been broken apart. Every major military asset that Iran has is destroyed. The US pulled off something against Iran that shouldn't be possible, and it rounded it all up with an attack against a key piece of territory that might serve as the launching pad for a ground invasion. Let's start with that key piece of territory, Kharg Island. On March 12th, the news broke the US had launched a massive strike against Kharg Island, located just 24 kilometers or 15 miles off the coast of Iran. That island is a vital part of Iran's oil industry, though it isn't the oil infrastructure that the US has targeted, at least not yet. America's devastating strikes leveled the military infrastructure built onto that island, with the BBC reporting that the US hit more than 90 individual targets, including missile storage bunkers, naval mine storage facilities, air defenses, a helicopter hangar, and an airport control tower. This amounts to the complete neutering of Kharg Island from a military perspective, and Iran is far from happy about it. In the wake of the attack, Iran threatened that all oil and energy infrastructure on the island that belongs to firms working with the US would immediately be destroyed and turned into a pile of ashes, which is a threat that is clearly supposed to imply that hitting Kharg Island will hurt the US more than it will hurt Iran. Oil is indeed the key when it comes to this island, however not in the way Iran is attempting to claim. The reality is that Kharg Island is far more important on the oil and gas fronts to Iran than it will ever be to the US, and the numbers prove it. According to Euronews, Kharg Island serves as the most important oil terminal in Iran's entire export system. About 90% of the country's crude oil exports leave Iran via this island, from which they all sail through the Strait of Hormuz and onto client nations such as China and other purchasers in Asia. Keep the Strait of Hormuz in mind, by the way. What the US is doing there is one of the big 5 strikes. When operating at its peak, Kharg Island allows for the loading of between 1.3 and 1.6 million barrels of crude oil per day. And Iran needs it because it offers deep water ports that allow for supercarriers to load that oil. Those carriers can't use many of Iran's mainland coastal ports because the water is too shallow. The BBC adds that oil and gas are key to Iran's faltering economy. The country's regime holds power over 10% of the world's proven oil reserves, along with 15% of its gas reserves, making energy the only industry that can really help to sustain Iran when it's struggling under the weight of heavy sanctions that prevent it from being an effective trade partner in any other arena. Iran's oil revenues have been on the rise in recent years. The Tehran Times claims those revenues hit $46 billion in 2024, which itself was a 14% increase, amounting to $5.6 billion over what it had sold in 2023. If 90% of Iran's oil flows through Kharg Island before being exported, it doesn't take a genius to figure out that strikes on that island have the ability to shatter Iran's entire economy. And this is an economy that wasn't doing particularly well even before the US launched Operation Epic Fury. The value of Iran's currency has dropped 95% against the US dollar since May 2018, the BBC reports. The state of Iran's economy is what sparked the late December and January protests that have ultimately led to the war we're seeing right now. Iran's regime can't afford to lose its oil facilities on Kharg Island. It hasn't, as the US has focused on military targets with its first round of strikes. But that mention of a first round tells you that the US is keeping its options open. America delivered a warning shot with these initial strikes, taking out everything Iran had that could protect Kharg Island in the process. Next up, the oil facilities, which US President Donald Trump has half-jokingly claimed that the US might hit a few more times just for fun. Iran's regime isn't laughing. It knows that the US holds the cards on Kharg Island, and it could strike again at any time to take out Iran's oil lifeline. While the attacks on Kharg Island may also have an impact on Iran's posture in the Strait of Hormuz, let's move on to number 2 of the big 5, Iran's destroyed military capabilities. From the moment that the US launched Operation Epic Fury in tandem with Israel's Operation Roaring Lion, it's been tearing through Iran's military infrastructure. That starts with the country's leadership. On February 28, which was the opening day of Operation Epic Fury, Trump declared that 48 of Iran's military and political leaders had been killed, including Iran's former supreme leader, Ali Khamenei. Many more have followed as the US and Israel batter Iran's leadership structure, which has the obvious knock-on effect of sending the entirety of Iran's military response into disarray. From there, the numbers make for terrible reading for what's left of Iran's regime. The Institute for the Study of War reports that Israel is claiming that airstrikes have knocked out up to 80% of Iran's air defenses. The Israeli Defense Forces, or IDF, also claims to have destroyed around 70% of Iran's missile launchers. What this means is that Iran has lost one of the largest threats that it could have posed to the allied forces that are raining firepower down on its territory every day. Losing most of its air defenses means that Iran can do nothing about the US establishing air superiority over the mainland. This, in turn, has allowed the US to bring non-stealth bombers and attack aircraft into the fray, as we've seen with the arrival of the B-1s, B-52s, and A-10 Warthogs in Iran. Though Iran can still present a small threat from isolated air defense units, 80% of its network being down opens the doors for the US and Israel to bring even more air power into their operations. That's key to the sustainment of air power after the initial shock and awe of the early strikes, which is a clue to another of the Big Five. And it also means that Iran finds itself stuck dealing with a compounding series of strikes. So many air defenses being taken out means that the rest of the country's air defenses are more vulnerable. And with each strike against this component of Iran's military, more avenues are opened up for bombers and attack aircraft to do their thing. Then there are the missile launchers. We said the IDF claims that 70% of those launchers have been destroyed, and we've seen the impact of that in Iran's use of its ballistic missiles. The rate of Iranian missile launches has been on a continuous decline since the beginning of the conflict. According to the Times of Israel, the IDF has mapped out this decline. Iran launched 90 missiles at Israel on the first day of the war. That dropped to 60 the following day. For about a week after, Iran launched 20 missiles per day, and it's now launching even fewer than that. Destroyed launchers are the primary cause of this loss of firepower, and it's a killer for Iran. There's a reason why the country built a stockpile of over 2,000 short-range ballistic missiles before the war, and had plans to build more. It wanted to use missile swarms to take out Israel and the US. Iran can't do that anymore. It can barely launch any missiles at all relative to what it planned to launch. And compounding that problem is that strikes against Iran's drone launch sites have led to the launches of unmanned aerial vehicles being down by 95% compared to the first day of Operation Epic Fury, per US Secretary of War Pete Hegseth. Iran's entire military doctrine revolved around being able to use these types of weapons, but it's been crippled both offensively and defensively on the ground. And it gets a whole lot worse, as the third of the Big Five has also left Iran practically useless at sea. But before we dig into that, if this is the kind of insight that you want to see, subscribe to the Military Show. We break it down like this every single week. Now Iran's Navy. It's not doing well. On March 16th, Admiral Brad Cooper, who is the commander of US Central Command, or CENTCOM, reported that the US has destroyed or damaged more than 100 of Iran's naval vessels. That's some achievement, given that Global Firepower reports that Iran's Navy had 109 assets before Operation Epic Fury. What this means is that the US has practically wiped the entire Iranian Navy off the map, if these numbers align as they appear. If they don't, which is possible as the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps operates a lot of fast boats that may not officially be part of Iran's Navy, it still means that the US is taking out naval targets left and right. Threats to the US naval presence in and around Iran's waters reduce with each of these assets that gets destroyed, as does the threat that Iran's Navy can pose to merchant ships sailing through the Strait of Hormuz. Again, stick with us, what the US is doing in that strait right now is the last of the Big Five. The Washington Post reports that satellite images from some of Iran's key naval bases highlight the sheer scale of damage that the US has caused. In Bandar Abbas, which is one of Iran's largest ports, along with being a key piece of the country's Strait of Hormuz strategy, warships are burning, and at least one of Iran's submarines appears to have been sunk. The US has also started to take out ships outside of Iranian waters. We see that with what happened to the Iris Dana, which the US struck off the coast of Sri Lanka. That warship now lies on the bottom of the Indian Ocean, along with at least 84 crew members who died in the US attack. The US has also taken out 16 of Iran's mine-laying vessels, which Iran intended to use to lay underwater mines along the Strait of Hormuz, thus making an already dangerous crossing outright treacherous for merchant ships attempting to transport their cargo via the strait. What that third of the Big Five reveals is just how quickly a country's navy can be crippled when it faces off against a nation that has far better ships and, perhaps most importantly, massive aircraft carriers from which it can launch strike after strike against key ports. Iran has lost frigates, drone carriers, submarines, ports, mine layers, maritime patrol aircraft, small surface combat ships, and basically everything that it would have been relying on to mount some sort of naval defense against the US. And what this means is something similar to what we're not seeing in the skies above Iran. In those skies, US aircraft can fly with near impunity. The same can now be said of the American aircraft carriers and naval strike groups that are in the Persian Gulf region. The scale of destruction has been so severe that Iran is in a position where it won't engage in any sort of ship-based combat for fear of losing what few assets it has left. It's been reduced to fast boat and unmanned surface vessel attacks against merchant ships, which isn't going to do a lot to stop the US from continuing to bombard the Iranian mainland with air power based on its carriers, along with bombers flying in from other bases. Speaking of air power, that brings us to number 4 of the Big Five, America's sustained pressure against Iran, which is made possible by the thousands of sorties being flown into the country. We touched on this earlier when discussing how the loss of so many of Iran's air defenses has allowed the US to deploy aircraft that it might not have deployed if the aerial situation remained risky. The use of B-52 bombers to strike Iran is perhaps the most prominent example, as these 70-plus-year-old bombers are about the farthest thing from being stealthy in America's aerial arsenal, but they're flying missions over Iran because of how utterly ruined Iran's air defense network is. Let's look at some numbers. According to the Wall Street Journal, the US claims that it has hit more than 7,000 targets across Iran. US Secretary of War Pete Hegseth says that the number is around 15,000 enemy targets hit when adding Israeli strikes on top. The war has been raging since February 28, which amounts to 19 days of strikes as of the creation of this video. In other words, an average of 789 targets are being struck in Iran every single day. This is the definition of a sustained air campaign. The US and Israel have managed to get into a routine of sorties that can see them rotating their air power without any blowback from Iran. A fighter jet or several can take off from a carrier, strike, return, refuel, and reload, and then go out again several times per day. Multiply that by dozens upon dozens of fighter jets across America's carriers flying from Israel and those taking off from US bases close to Iran, and you get a non-stop strike pattern for which Iran has no answer. What all of this amounts to is the systematic degradation of a military and Iranian regime that have festered for over 40 years, and it's being made possible by American air power. There are far too many strikes to detail here, but some of the heaviest are the previously mentioned attacks on Kharg Island, which may soon be followed up, and the US using its 30,000-pound massive ordnance penetrators against the Talagan 2 underground bunker. And now that the UK has given the US permission to use its bases, including RAF Fairford, America's bomber pilots no longer have to fly exhausting round-trip flights that they were making to launch their attacks earlier in the war. The distance to cover before hitting Iran has been cut. The entire Atlantic Ocean can now be circumvented. And what this means is that American bombers can now unleash on Iran far faster than they could before, joining an already non-stop fighter jet rotation. What we saw early in Operation Epic Fury was the dismantlement of Iran's air defenses and missile capabilities. With the 4th of the Big Five, the US is now taking out missile production facilities, underground complexes, command and control centers, and every aspect of Iran's industrial base that it can find. It's no longer just about taking out Iran's military. It's about making it so that the Iranian military can never rebuild, at least while it's being hit with this absolute deluge of air power. Still, Iran has one bit of leverage to which it desperately clings, and that brings us back to the last of the Big Five, the Strait of Hormuz. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the single most important waterways in the entire world, especially when it comes to the transportation of seaborne oil. About a fifth of the world's oil trade transits this strait, amounting to 21 million barrels per day, and at just 24 miles wide at its narrowest point, the Strait of Hormuz is far too easy for Iran to patrol. While there is some traffic moving through the strait, it's going through at a trickle compared to what we should be seeing. The reason why is clear. Iran has threatened to hit ships traveling through the Strait of Hormuz, and it's followed through on those threats several times already. With the strait still effectively blockaded, we've also seen oil prices rocket up to above $100 per barrel, where they're still hovering. This is Iran's last plan. Block the strait, cause chaos in the oil industry, and hope that the pressure created is enough to make the US back off. It isn't working. Along with calls for its allies to join in the protection of merchant ships sailing through the Strait of Hormuz, which have been accompanied by a handful of criticisms and vague threats to those who don't want to get involved, the US has turned its attention to direct strikes near the strait. On March 17th, news broke that the US had started to pound Iranian missile launch sites near the Strait of Hormuz with bunker-busting bombs. CENTCOM delivered this news directly in an X post where it said, "Hours ago, US forces successfully employed multiple 5,000-pound deep penetrator munitions on hardened Iranian missile sites along Iran's coastline near the Strait of Hormuz." While this might look like yet more strikes against Iran's missile launch sites, these particular hits are all about preventing the anti-ship cruise missiles that Iran can launch from targeting merchant ships in the strait. The US, having destroyed Iran's military and leadership structures, as well as levied a massive threat against its economy, is now actively protecting one of the world's most critical waterways, and more may be coming. The US is also sending the 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit to the Middle East. That unit, which contains about 2,200 US Marines, along with equipment that includes amphibious assault vessels, isn't set to arrive until the end of March, but once it's in the Persian Gulf region, the unit may start launching coastal raids against key Iranian military nodes that line the coast of the Strait of Hormuz. The ports and missile launch sites that have already been battered could be taken over entirely, allowing the US to create a sort of buffer into which it can place air defenses, thus minimizing the threat that Iran poses to the strait from deeper into the mainland. If other nations join the US in defending that strait, as France is considering once the situation in the waterway calms down, Iran loses its last piece of leverage. The crumbling Iranian regime wants the oil price shock to stop the US in its tracks. Rather than bowing to the pressure, the US has unleashed the fifth of the Big Five on the Strait of Hormuz, and it may have a lot more yet up its sleeve. One major blow after another has broken Iran. The Big Five prove that the US holds all of the cards in Operation Epic Fury. As for Iran, its military infrastructure, along with its regime, is getting weaker by the day. And as the US follows up, likely with attacks against more Strait of Hormuz nodes and against Kharg Island, a bad situation will only get much worse for Iran. Oh, and none of this mentions the fact that the US has also brought weapons pulled straight out of a sci-fi film to Operation Epic Fury. Lasers are in play, and they're ruining Iran's attempts to use drones against the US. Do you want to find out how? Well, check out our video, which covers the ultra-modern weapons that Iran could never have imagined being unleashed. And if you enjoyed this video, make sure you subscribe to The Military Show to see more of our Iran war coverage. And thank you for watching.